Well, glad to have you back again so we can keep working in this section, this little module on intercultural communication. You probably noticed I get pretty excited about this, and I could go a long time talking about intercultural communication. I do wish I had more time, but I don't. So today we're going to try and wrap up this little kind of mini module class on intercultural communication. And we'll go on to some other things. Now I'll keep bumping back to this every now and then and referring to it as I go along with other things, but for the actual focus on it, today will be the last day. When you get into another country, when you get into another culture, things are just simply going to be different. We've talked about so many aspects of that, the logical system, the way they use language, what makes sense to them, what doesn't, all of that type of thing. That all affects the way we communicate. I've spoken about different logical systems and the way material or information is presented. And so today I'm going to present something to you in story format, which would be, as you know by now, dispersion logic or storytelling method, we would sometimes say. If I were in class with all of you, I wish I could be. I much prefer classroom settings rather than the internet, but we have to do what we have to do. We have to adapt our communication method to the culture of the moment, and right now internet learning is kind of a big thing. So if I had you all in class, I would do something to illustrate this. So let me tell you what I do, and I think you can figure out pretty quickly how this fits in. If I'm in a class, I will usually ask for a volunteer from one of the young ladies in the class. And I'll tell her beforehand I'm going to be doing something with you that I want to do to illustrate some of the things we're talking about here. And then I'll be quite honest and I'll say it'll probably be something that's going to make you a bit uncomfortable. So if you're willing to come up and help me, and if you don't mind being made a little bit uncomfortable, I would appreciate some help. And I think every class I've ever had, one of the young ladies says, "Yeah, I'll help you. I don't mind that." So this young lady will come up, and then I'll just say or explain to the class, now I'm going to talk to her as if she were an American visitor that had come to visit my church in Colombia, South America. And everything that I'm going to do, the things that I say, the way that I interact would be very typical to the way that a person down there would interact with a young lady in this case who had arrived for a visit. Now, after that explanation, the first thing I do is I get very close to her. In America, we typically talk to somebody about arm's length away, 30 inches, something like that, 36 inches. That's our comfort distance. And so you look around campus, see 2 or 3 people standing there talking, and pay attention to how close they are or how far apart they are. See if I'm wrong on that. You'll see most of the time they're roughly an arm's length away, about 3 feet. But in Latin America, we don't do that. When we talk to somebody in Latin America, we're more like a foot or 16 inches away, something like that. So the first thing I do, and this lady comes up, and a young lady comes up, and I'm going to talk to her, I walk right up to her, and I'm very close to her. And as I start talking to her, I'm friendly and all that, and chit-chat and all this kind of stuff, then I reach out and I put my hand on her arm. I start touching her. I start maybe rubbing her arm a little bit. And as I'm doing this, it's very obvious she's becoming very uncomfortable in the situation very quickly. Now, I warned her ahead of time she was going to do that. She knew it, and yet, even though she knew it, she was still feeling uncomfortable very quickly. Now, she does something that every American would do in that situation, and I've never had this fail to happen, and I've used this example in 30, 40 times in different classes over the years, something like that. As I do this, she'll invariably step back. She wants to be far enough away that she feels comfortable, and she wants to be far enough away that it's not going to be so easy for me to be touching her. Now, I'm not touching anything, I shouldn't be touching there, really. I'm touching, just her arm. But you don't do that in America. You do in Colombia. In fact, in Colombia, if I'm not standing close, and if I'm not touching you as I talk to you, especially if it's a young lady or a woman, she would perceive that I'm angry with her, or that I'm upset with her, or that I don't like her, or that I find something about her offensive. And in that case, she will probably be hurt by it. So as this young lady steps back, I'd step up close again. And I'd start touching her arm a little bit again, and she would step back a little bit more. And after we've done this 2 or 3 times, the class is starting to laugh, because they're seeing what's going on and all. And then I call an end to it. I don't want to make her too uncomfortable. I have her sit back down. Then I explain what happened. I said, we have a different sense of personal space here than many people in the world. Colombia, it's much less. And and that I didn't even do anything that was maybe good friends. As a result, when an American goes down there, if they're not forewarned, they often find it very uncomfortable at first. And they often feel that maybe people are being overtly impositive in their efforts to interact, things of that nature. But they're simply acting the way a person is expected to act in that culture when they talk, when they have an interaction. So these are the types of things that you have to learn, you have to get used to. And I didn't go as far as I said, as I would have if it had been maybe a person that was kind of like a friend or something like that. In that case, I would have actually maybe put my hand on her shoulder and I leaned up, maybe giving her a kiss on the cheek or something like that. Obviously, that would have been very, very different and very much more beyond the limits of what's acceptable in American culture, because we don't do things that way. Now, I've got to be very careful. When I first get back to Colombia, I'm thinking in Colombian. I'm thinking in Spanish. I'm thinking in the way they do things down there. And I go to church and I have to conscientiously be telling myself, now don't stand so close to people. Now don't touch people up here. Just don't grab them and hug them just because you haven't seen them for a little while, something like that. Just be standoffish by Colombian thoughts or standards. So I program myself. I work on it. I went back to Colombia once after being here in the States for a few months. I think I'd been teaching KCU that fall. It was KCC back then. And got back down to the church there, and one of the young ladies that I knew quite well, known her since she was a little tiny tyke, and she was happy to see me, and she'd come running up to greet me and everything, and I said, hi, how are you, just like that, and boom, I kind of stopped, and she kind of paused, jerked a little bit, and says, oh, okay then, and turned around and left. Right away I realized what I'd done. I realized I'd offended her, and I went very quick, and I said, pardon me, I'm sorry, I just got back from the States, I'm thinking in American culture there, so I didn't know how to act. Please pardon me. And then I gave her a little bit of a hug, and I gave her a kiss on her cheek, and I stood and chit-chatted for a couple minutes and had my arm on her shoulder, or my hand on her shoulder as we talked. And then everything was fine. But see, when I first got back, I had done it the American way. It was a short, curt, hi, how are you type thing, standing off at this distance, brought an end to it, and then moved on to someone else. And up here, that would have been perfect. It would have been fine. Down there, it was wrong, and it was hurtful. And that's me. And I've lived down there. And I still have to kind of switch gears when I go down there and first get there. I have to watch myself for the first little while, so I do it right down there. When I get back up here, I have to try and switch out of Colombian mode and think American again and do it up here. Otherwise, I'm going to have people thinking I'm weird or something. Well, maybe I am, and you probably already figured that out, but I certainly don't want to be offending people, and I certainly don't want to have them start thinking, something's wrong with this guy here. He's a psycho or something. So that is how intercultural interaction and communication is so critical, and how it affects us if we don't know how to do it right. Now, there's a couple things in that area that I want to talk about very specifically. This is a little sort of chit-chat type thing, how we do it, but then also things come in, what do we talk about? Down there it's one thing, up here it's another thing. Up here we talk about the weather, we talk about, hi, how are you? But we really don't want to know. That's the question you ask, and I say, fine, and you, sort of a thing. Don't really answer truthfully. We maybe have a cold, we may be not been able to sleep last night, whatever, but somebody says, hi, how are you? Oh, fine, so of course, so now when we're telling the truth, that doesn't come in there. So that perfectly relating what we say to exactly how things are, that doesn't fit there. So in our American culture, that's not lying, even though it is by our standards. So you have to look at what people talk about. And that's why I hit this research concept so much when I teach. When you go somewhere, observe, pay attention, focus on what's going on. See what they talk about, see what they refer to, see what comes into the conversations in the very beginning, what they talk about as they're sitting around for a while, things like that. And you'll start to pick up pretty quickly if they do things differently. And if I want to fit in down here, I've got to learn to do things differently. So even things like the chit-chat, it's not the same all over the world. And what is included and how it's done will be very different. Next thing I'd like to talk about is humor. Now, humor and poetry are two of the things that are very difficult to understand and to come to learn in another culture. Because what's funny up here isn't funny down there. What they laugh at down there might seem very inappropriate to us. And that's hard to figure out because that's part of what's been programmed into us as a child. I've got grandchildren. As they come over here, I would kid them when they were very small and everything and tease them and have fun with them and all that. And at first, little kids don't know about joking. They presume everything you're saying is just right on gospel truth type thing. That's it. So after a little while, you're joking with them and they start figuring out, wait a minute, the way he's acting probably isn't what I think it is. And so when my kids were little, and my grandchildren were little, and I'd be trying to teach them to joke and clown around with them a little bit and everything, they'd come over and pretty soon they start saying, Grandpa, you're joking, right? And I'd say, yeah. And then they'd laugh. They didn't laugh until they asked if it was a joke. And when I told them it's a joke, they laughed. Because you see, they hadn't learned when to laugh yet. You're taught when to laugh by your parents. That's not natural. It's a learned practice or experience. And so that's the type of thing we have to learn as we go somewhere else. One specific example in Colombia, for many years that we've been down there, it has been an incredibly violent and dangerous place. During the war years, when the war was really hot down there, Colombia ranked for like 20 years in a row as the most violent and dangerous nation in the entire world. And that was true of even places where there's a war going on. Iraq, when the Iraq War was going on way back when, Colombia was worse. And so in a country where there's very high levels of danger and violence and everything of that nature, people start to laugh and joke about violence and awe. And Americans that would come down would be shocked by that. They're joking about people getting blown up. But you have to. It's a defense mechanism. So in the worst of all this violence down there and everything, somebody came up with one of these T-shirts that has a cartoon character on it. It had Calvin and Hobbes. I don't know if you've ever seen Calvin and Hobbes. That guy quit making those a long time ago. It was a little boy and his imaginary pet tiger that he had, and they'd talk back and forth and all that kind of stuff. It was just typical stuff, and it was maybe sort of sarcastic or philosophic or whatever, but it was popular. In fact, the guy quit doing it not because it wasn't popular. He just said, I don't want to do it anymore, and I made enough money, I don't need to. And now he lives as kind of a hermit up by Cleveland somewhere. But in this cartoon, it was typical kid interactions with adults and this imaginary pet tiger that he had. Well, somebody down there did a parody of that. They had a cartoon of Calvin and Hobbes, and Calvin, the little kid, is talking to his pet tiger. Well, in this picture, it shows his dad sitting there in his lazy boy, and his dad's head's laying on the floor, and his headless body's sitting in the lazy boy. And there's Calvin with a machine gun. And Hobbes, the tiger, says, Calvin, I think you went a little bit too far this time. And the guy said, and Calvin said, nah, he had it coming. Well, they all laughed at that. I bought one and brought it up here and showed it to people, and people were horrified by it. Well, what's the difference? It's cultural. And it was a defense mechanism of a people living in a very violent culture. Now that the violence has subsided, that type of humor has kind of disappeared, but it was there. So things like humor are very different. Poetry is even more so. It's incredibly unusual, if it ever happens, that a person could get to the point where they can write meaningful poetry in a language other than their childhood heart language. It just simply doesn't happen. That becomes too personal. That becomes too intimate. So that's the reason culture and things like that are so very different. Now, there are other things that come in there too. What is proper and what is not proper? Now, I kind of gave you a vignette or a little view of that when I gave you the example at the beginning. Now, up here, when do we touch people? Well, not too often, really. Generally, American culture is a non-touching culture. We just don't touch. Okay, that's fine. We're good or bad. It's just the way we do it. But in other cultures, they are. In fact, somebody went to Colombia once, was down there for a while, and they said Colombia has a huggy-touchy culture. They had figured that out pretty quickly. As a lady, by the way, the women tend to be more perceptive than we guys do. We're kind of clueless at times. But this lady going down there, and she says, the Colombians are different than we are. Oh, yeah, they are. What they got huggy, touchy culture. Okay, actually, she figured it out very quickly, and so they had learned that. She had learned that. So what is proper up here? Well, you do stand off a ways. You typically don't touch unless you know people really well. We're in church, some churches now say, "Oh, give everybody a hug," and we go kind of do it, but it's usually sort of forced or imposed. It's not natural to our culture. Maybe we're changing a little bit, but it's not what was commonly done. In Colombia, it was. Not only was it commonly done, in Colombia, it would be offensive if you didn't do it. And they made fun of Americans. They had a picture of, I think it was President George Bush once, and he went to somewhere in Colombia, no, Brazil he was. He was in Brazil at that time. He went to Brazil, and it shows him interacting with people. And he did what Americans did. One of these Brazilian guys walks up to him real quick and kind of hugs him and puts his hand on him and all that and everything. And what's George Bush do? He kind of uncomfortably puts up with it, but then he immediately steps way back and kind of brushes off his sleeves or something. Well, he's probably worried about him wrinkled or who knows what. And down there, they just ripped that in the press because they said, look, he thinks we Latin Americans are dirty. And if we touch him, we're going to make him dirty. And so he didn't want to be touched by us dirty Latin Americans. And they went on and on about that. Well, poor old President Bush, he had no idea what he'd done. He just reacted the way Americans had reacted. And apparently nobody told him before he went down there. He apparently didn't have any preparation or training in intercultural communication, and so he did it all wrong, and he made some negative points both for the United States and for himself personally, and he became a rather unpopular president down there, not because of any of these specifics, but because of all of this, maybe these failures or shortcomings in intercultural communication, in knowing what's proper and what's not proper in that culture, and kind of knowing at least a little bit about what you talk about, what you don't talk about, what's proper, what isn't proper. Now, I'm going to come back to this a little bit later when I talk about maybe modesty in dress and a few things like that. Now, I'll explain a little bit more, but at this time, this is this aspect of intercultural communication. It's why it's so critical. It's why it's so important. It's why I wish I could give you a whole lot more. Okay, we'll be moving on to a different topic in our next class.